Pittsburgh is covered with tracks, and they're not new. Those T's that we all know and love began running 35 years ago, but public rail lines in the city began 160 years ago. Let's just say there's a lot of history on these tracks. Our story begins in the 1850s. Pittsburgh was already an industrial giant and was called the Iron City at the time. The city was experiencing incredible expansion population-wise, but in terms of cubic area, growth was stunted. Transportation was limited to one's own feet and horse-drawn carriages, forcing residents to live within close range of their work, making a daily commute from, say, present-day Bethel Park impossible. But in 1889, the first step towards such transit was taken when Pittsburgh's first horse car line opened along Penn Avenue and 34th Street.
Within a decade, rail lines stretched out across 22 miles of track and spilled over the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers, and the city followed, annexing local communities and expanding its territory. In 1889, the horse cars found company when cable cars appeared on Fifth Avenue, while at the same time, other competition arose along 13th Street when the first electric streetcar line opened.
Ultimately, it was the trolleys that survived the turn of the century, and in 1902, when Thomas Edison recorded his trip across the 6th Street Bridge, he found a buzzing city with trolleys lining the roads. That same year, Pittsburgh's three major rail transit companies merged into Pittsburgh Railways, consolidating 1,100 trolleys and 400 miles of track. The new company would suffer from frequent bankruptcies and strikes for much of its history, but its first challenge would be to redesign its inventory of streetcars. Riders took issue with the narrow doors, high steps, and overcrowding of the contemporary models, so Pittsburgh Railways took it upon themselves to make a new, standardized car that would address these complaints.
By 1914, they at least addressed one when they rolled out their monstrous 14-foot-high double-decker trolley onto 5th and Highland Avenue. About a dozen such streetcars were produced and ran for over a decade, but safety concerns had them off the tracks by 1926. Their departure was met with few tears. Residents' disdain for the vehicles was perhaps best summed up by Vince Sweeney of the Pittsburgh Press, who at the time wrote, "Pittsburgh may be a double-barreled, double-edged, double-dyed, double-faced, and at times double-charged town, but it is not a double-decker." The company found better luck in 1915 when the Jones car was introduced, named after the company's general manager, P.N. Jones, who tasked his men at Westinghouse Electric to construct a trolley with a smaller motor. A smaller motor meant a lower floor and a wider base, in turn requiring less steps for boarding and increasing seat capacity. The new model elicited a more favorable response from riders, and Pittsburgh Railways stocked up on 1,000 of their new standardized streetcars.
As the Great Depression hit the United States, America's major transit companies assembled at the Electric Railway President's Conference Committee to both discuss the growing threat to automobiles posed to the trolley industry and to oversee the planning and construction of a nationwide standardized streetcar. Pittsburgh Railways held an active seat at the committee. In fact, their innovation with the Jones car was vital in laying the foundations for the new vehicle.
7 years of research, testing, and revision produced a streamlined design of the PCC trolley.
A model of speed and convenience that would hopefully lure depression-weary residents off of the streets and into its seats. Pittsburgh Railways received its first batch of vehicles in 1937, one of which, car number 100, was the world's first PCC to enter service. A massive advertising campaign was undertaken, with posters and public demonstrations boasting all the comfortable new features. The vehicles boasted cushier seats and wheels with noise-reducing rubber to make your commute a silent ride. On a more practical note were the improved safety features that came from shifting the motor controls from the wide gang switch to these 3 foot pedals. On the right is the accelerator, in the middle is the brake, and to the left is the dead man switch. When operating the vehicle, this pedal would have to be constantly pushed down while the driver shifted his other foot between the accelerator and the brake. If at some point the driver became incapacitated or went unconscious, well, no problem, because once released, the dead man switch would bring the vehicle to an emergency stop. And the PCC trolley would slow down quickly, 5 times faster than an average streetcar, because of a 3-part system of dynamic, magnetic, and conventional air brakes.
The dynamic brakes would start by reversing the motor and reducing its energy by releasing it as heat. Then magnetic brakes would clamp down onto the track, and air brakes would pump air to slow it to a complete stop.
The PCCs were standardized, remained customizable, and beyond the basic adaptations to fit the infrastructure of certain cities, the design underwent further modification. Besides a few cosmetic changes, there was little difference in the various models until the 16,000 series in 1945, which replaced those air pump brakes with fully electric ones, a minor innovation, but one that became a nationwide standard. This particular unit was part of the 17,000 series, those last 100 trolleys built for Pittsburgh. These models introduced some extra convenience like ventilation systems and standee windows that would allow standing passengers to see their stop.
The 1700s also had sealed windows, intended as a safety precaution and to improve the effectiveness of the new ventilation system, but was only successful in making passengers unbearably hot for the vehicle's next 50 years of service.
Admittedly, $28,000 per unit went a long way, because the 1700s sustained well into the 1970s without requiring any major renovations. Early changes foregoed the red and white paint scheme of the vehicles for a colorful spectrum of occasionally psychedelic designs. More extensive repairs occurred in 1981 when 12 1700s were essentially completely rebuilt, with the exception of their outer shelling. This 1729 was renamed number 4007 and placed along the Blue Line Library route. Therefore, it now rests 2 blocks from South Park Station, which it passed countless times over the course of a decade. This vehicle has since been repainted and restored to its 1949 condition, back to a time when Pittsburgh Railways ascended to its height of success, back to an era which would, unfortunately, not last long.
One sure way to spoil a shopping trip is to find yourself trapped in a traffic jam, or not being able to find a place to park, or find a place to park and then have to walk 10 blocks to the store. Who needs it? Going shopping on a PATH bus is convenient, safe, economical, and comfortable.
By the 1950s, the automobile industry had risen to prominence and gained a seat in the competitive world of public transit. The 16 downtown bus lines and the 21 suburban routes, a real threat to Pittsburgh Railways.
The war for ridership throughout the decade proved no benefits for, the riders themselves, as service quality took a major nosedive for all 33 of Pittsburgh's transportation companies. The public outcry over the lack of standardized fares, the incompatibility between services, and the deteriorating equipment that remained in use prompted City Council to form a collective transit system. In 1959, the Pittsburgh River Management Agency, Port Authority of Allegheny County, was selected to oversee the new transportation system and consolidate the 33 transportation agencies at a cost of $26.2 million.
Throughout the years of negotiations, Port Authority began developing their transportation service, launching the Early Action Program with the aim to reduce traffic congestion on Pittsburgh streets. The plan called for 2 exclusive bus highways and to cut back trolley service in favor of an entirely new form of rapid transit.
The proposal was the Transit Expressway Revenue Line, a collaboration between Westinghouse Electric, now Bombardier International, and Port Authority, and is more popularly known as Skybus. Small, lightweight, rubber-tired vehicles would operate on an elevated track with no onboard driver. Rather, the cars would be navigated remotely at the control station. All elements were necessary for the intended rapid service, in which cars would arrive every 2 minutes, 24/7. To call it ambitious would be an understatement, but the concept did show its potential, namely because they did build it.
In 1963, the construction of a testing site in South Hills was approved. This region was selected for its varied terrains, close proximity to the city, and the annual county fair, which would allow the locals to ride Skybus for themselves. A 9,340-foot long track was built along Corrigan Drive, with a majority of the track 15 to 35 feet above ground. Along the line, 2 stations were also constructed.
An elevated south station built here in the South Park Fairgrounds, along with the ground-level North Station, which served as the control center for the vehicles and is the sole remaining portion of the line.
An order for 3 Skybus vehicles was made to the St. Louis Car Company, and a 4th car was manufactured in-house by Westinghouse. Testing began in the summer of 1965, and public demonstrations began that fall. Attendees of that year's Allegheny County Fair were asked to fill a questionnaire based on their opinions of the ride. But despite the generally positive response, opposition began to rise.
The Skybus test track had already received criticism for its over $5 million expense, and the proposed $740 million service line received far less support.
In June 1966, Skybus's first phase of testing came to an end, and after adjustments to the vehicles and track, a second phase began to better determine hill climbing abilities and weather endurance. In November of 1971, 120,000 miles worth of testing was finally completed, but the trials of Skybus were only beginning.
Port Authority's transit program called for the elimination of Pittsburgh streetcar lines, an extreme move which polarized politicians across the county. The agency's entire service was dependent on Skybus' success, and though they desperately tried to promote the expressway, many could not be convinced. Lawsuits were filed against Port Authority by Pittsburgh communities who wished to retain their trolley's exclusive right-of-ways, and negotiations between certain municipalities and the agency did little to tide the conflict. Each act of opposition cost millions of dollars in delays, so in 1972, Port Authority launched into construction on the Transit Expressway, hoping to make significant progress before they are contested in court. Work began for a station in Castle Shannon, on land eventually to be used for this T-station, and a site was prepared in South Hills Village for a Skybus storage and maintenance facility. Renovations on the Wabash Tunnel, Skybus's gateway to downtown Pittsburgh, had the greatest progress, with concrete set and tracks laid. Port Authority's ambitions were ultimately in vain, as growing opposition forced the project's main investor, the Urban Mass Transit Administration, to reconsider their funding. In 1974, the UMTA had Skybus re-examined, but their consultant's positive review produced no end to the arguments. The administration grew weary of the conflict, so placed a 120-day limit for an agreement to be made between the parties, or else funding would be cut off. Port Authority managed to race against the clock and make a concession with the opposition to hire another consultant to re-examine the project. The 1975 report spelled the end for Skybus, advising that the proposal be dropped due to high costs, environmental factors, and the already available streetcar transit. Port Authority risked losing funding for future projects if they continued to push the service, and so they reluctantly dropped the Skybus program. Years after the project died, the elevated test track still remained in South Hills, so Allegheny County had the public decide how to repurpose it. A few dauntless county commissioners suggested converting it into an elevated bike ramp, Skybike as they called it, though ultimately in the 1980s the track was simply demolished. While Skybus wasn't able to fulfill that transit dream, Westinghouse was able to use that technology to produce smaller systems for the Tampa and Seattle-Tacoma international airports. They're no longer referred to as Skybus, because it turned out an airline had already trademarked that name. Rather, they're now generally referred to as people movers. Even the Pittsburgh International Airport eventually received one of these people movers in 1992, though by now the design has evolved far beyond these original vehicles. The death of the Skybus program will not be the salvation for the streetcars as Pittsburgh's communities had hoped. The cost of maintaining trolley lines had grown immensely over the years as more and more vehicles fell into disrepair. The Port Authority certainly didn't have funds to renovate their entire fleet, so the agency began planning extensive busways throughout South Hills and downtown Pittsburgh to replace the decrepit streetcar system. Debates once again flared up in South Hills over the elimination of their streetcars, but this time, compromises were reached between Port Authority and the municipalities with a proposal to upgrade their old trolley lines with a new, modern light rail system.
In 1978, Port Authority obtained a $265 million federal grant to begin the first stage of development on the T, which also included the long-awaited construction of a downtown subway. Groundbreaking began in 1981 along Grant Street, 6th Avenue, and Liberty Avenue, and and construction repurposed old structures like the Panhandle Tunnel for Steel Plaza Station and the Panhandle Bridge as the gateway to the city. On July 7, 1985, downtown trolleys switched over to underground service, accompanied by Port Authority's new modern light rail vehicles, or LRVs.
As operation on the Pittsburgh subway began, the sprawling trolley lines of South Hills were being compacted into the now familiar light rail network. And while the system's routes remain fairly the same today, there are a few notable exceptions. In downtown Pittsburgh, a short spur line runs from Steel Plaza to the now disused Penn Station, which fell out of regular service in 1993. The stop served to connect passengers with the Union Amtrak station and to connect commuters with the East Busway. Ultimately, Penn Station proved to be rather impractical, and the reason was infrastructure.
The tunnel between Steel Plaza and Penn Station is single-tracked. Therefore, only one light rail vehicle could travel between the two stations at any given time. The solution would have been to add a second track, but that was impossible because the spur line skirts under the U.S. Steel Tower, whose foundations surround the track on all sides, leaving no room for expansion.
Ultimately, considering the route's low ridership, it didn't really seem worth the effort, and Penn Station was discontinued from regular service in 1993, 5 years after opening. Like many defunct light rail routes, the station and track were well maintained, and Port Authority even found use for Penn in 2011 as a detour in anticipation for Super Bowl 45. As for those trying to catch their next train out of Pittsburgh, the Pat bus remains a viable option.
Just outside the downtown area lies the Allentown Line, a mile track which harkens back to the city's former trolley lines by running directly on Warrington and Arlington Avenues. There are 10 stops along the route where the neighborhood's residents can catch their bus, and until 2011, they could also catch the T.
While since then, no light rail vehicle has stopped in Allentown, many vehicles have passed through it, as a detour whenever the Mount Washington Tunnel undergoes repairs. Because this Port Authority keeps the track well maintained, prompting a recent movement to return a regular service to the line and bring convenience and economic activity to the area.
Conversely, there's also concern over the cost of reinstating rail service to the neighborhood, which is already serviced by 4 bus routes, and how much it will delay inbound South Hills riders. As of yet, there has been no verdict. The modern light rail network couldn't have come sooner, as Pittsburgh streetcars were decaying much faster than expected. In 1988, after a slew of equipment failures, Port Authority examined its fleet of PCC trolleys to discover that 36 of them had dangerously deteriorated electric wiring. They were immediately pulled from service and either scrapped or cannibalized for parts. Only 4 streetcars in all of Pittsburgh remained.
And they operated right here. This is the Drake Line, specifically a portion which diverges from Dorchester, and whose prior stations were serviced exclusively by trolleys, though both the stations and evidently the streetcars have since been removed.
Remarkably, the entire track still remains, and by following it, we can step back in time to the last harbor of the Pittsburgh streetcar. Just below Dorchester lies Bethel Church, named after the adjacent Bethel Church Road, and followed by Fort Couch, which rests beside the tunnel under its namesake road. Next, we enter Brookside, with a stop at Brookside Boulevard as the track twists right towards Brookside Farms. Our last stop is Walter, but though this is where passengers would depart from the Drake Line, the trolley itself would continue down the hill
towards the Drake Loop, which has since been transformed into this person's backyard, but was previously where the streetcars would turn around and head back up the line. By 1999, the end was certain. The cost of maintaining Pittsburgh's final 3 trolleys had grown immensely, with an estimated $1 million required to retain their service for another 2 years. There was no choice but to retire the vehicles. This chapter of Pittsburgh rail history did not close unnoticed. Rail enthusiasts from as far as England made pilgrimages to South Hills during that last week of operation, joining regular commuters up and down the track to bid farewell to the streetcars.
On Saturday, September 4th, 1999, the Drake Line enjoyed its final day of scheduled service. The celebrations really kicked off the following day with the PCC Trolley Fan Trip. The 3 streetcars arrived with their nameplates replaced with the phrases "A PCC Finale," "Farewell PCCs," and "The Goodbye Friends." The cars toured up and down the Drake line and the Library line a few times, making numerous photo stops while also trying not to disrupt the light rail vehicles, before finishing off with speed runs on both routes. And then it was over. The streetcars were gone, with a bus in their place. 1 vehicle was donated to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, another 2 were sold to San Francisco's transit agency, Muni, and the 1 car, which was held in reserve at the time, lies on display at Port Authority's South Hills Village Depot. As the streetcar era came to a close, so continued the upgrade of the light rail network, specifically the Overbrook line, which had been left out during the first stage of development. It was assumed that the old streetcar route could be sustained until funding arrived for reconstruction, but by 1993, deterioration had already taken its toll.
Particularly along its bridges, now safety concerns, the entire line was shut down. The funding eventually came in 1999 and kicked off Stage 2 of light rail development, which didn't so much upgrade the track, but rather rebuilt it entirely. And by this point, Port Authority already had plans brewing for a 3rd stage of development.
In 1993, Port Authority released the Spine Line Corridor Study, which analyzed 3 potential routes to extend the subway eastward from downtown Pittsburgh to Oakland, along with the connector to Squirrel Hill and the connector to the North Shore. Ultimately, with the project's estimated $1 billion cost, the Allegheny County Board of Commissioners sought the cheaper option of limiting the expansion to the North Shore.
Once the destination was set, questions arose over how the vehicles would physically cross the Allegheny River.
An early plan suggested making use of the spur line between Steel Plaza and Penn Station by extending the track over the Fort Wayne Railroad Bridge and into the North Shore, but the Port Authority favored an alternative path from Gateway, tunneling underneath the river to get into the North Shore. Included in these plans was a new spur line from Steel Plaza to the David Lawrence Convention Center. It was dropped in late 2005 to keep the project within budget. Nevertheless, when drilling began the following year, the initial cost of $365 million had already ballooned to $435 million. As excavation commenced underground, the project ran into controversy between those who saw the connector as a way to develop the North Shore, and those who derided the connector as a waste of federal spending. The crew broke through into the North Shore in 2009, but not before giving the opposition credit, as the overall cost inflated to $552 million, with the risk of the operation shut down unless an extra $117 million was secured. The funds were received and the project continued with uncertainty until the North Shore connector was finally unveiled in 2012.
As routes have expanded and retracted over the years, the question remains of where the T will go next.
There seems little interest in expanding any further northward, but quite a bit in expanding eastward to Oakland. The Spine Line has popped up several times over the years, now with some interesting artistic depictions of how far it could run. Suggestions have also been made for expanding eastward to the Pittsburgh International Airport and reinstating the old Allentown line.
Ultimately, as proposals are passed back and forth, for both the T and the city's rail history in general, this remains the end of the line.